It was me. With a Bible in one hand and a hammer of self-righteousness in the other, I was the one who destroyed my mother's most sacred heirloom. It was a plaster statue, no taller than my forearm, painted in faded blues and whites, the Virgin Mary. To my mother, it was a window to heaven. To me, it was an idol, an abomination. And so, in front of my sister Sarah, who was on her knees sobbing, begging me to stop, I raised it high. I can still feel the cold, chalky texture of the plaster against my palm. I remember the look in my sister's eyes. Not just sadness, but a kind of horrified pity, as if she were watching a man set himself on fire. "This is a graven image, Sarah. The word of God forbids it," I roared. My voice echoed in the house that was suddenly too quiet, a house that still smelled of my mother's lavender soap. And then I brought it down. I smashed it on the marble floor of the entryway. The sound wasn't loud, not like breaking glass. It was a dull, sickening crack, followed by the gritty skitter of 1,000 white fragments scattering across the polished stone like broken teeth. That sound, the sound of my family's faith shattering, that was the prologue to my own destruction, and, in a way that I still struggle to comprehend, the beginning of my salvation. My name is Arthur, and I am 62 years old. For 35 of those years I was Pastor Arthur. I stood in pulpits across the Midwest, a man forged in the crucible of strict doctrine and the letter of the law. I believed the Bible was inerrant, infallible, and the only guide for a righteous life. My faith wasn't a comfort. It was a fortress, and I was one of its proudest soldiers. I preached a hard gospel because I believed in a holy God who demanded purity. There was no room for ambiguity, no space for statues or saints or rosaries. Those were the trappings of a diluted faith, relics of paganism that had crept into the church. And the most offensive of all to me was the veneration of Mary. I saw it as a direct assault on the singular glory of Christ. A mother, yes. A blessed woman, of course. But a queen of heaven? An intercessor? To me, it was blasphemy, plain and simple. I grew up in a house divided by that very belief. My father was a man much like me, a stern Lutheran, who saw God in the starkness of a plain wooden cross. My mother, God rest her soul, was a cradle Catholic. Her faith was a vibrant, living tapestry of scents and symbols. The smell of incense, the flicker of votive candles, the smooth, worn beads of her rosary slipping through her fingers as she prayed in the evenings. And everywhere, there was Mary. A small statue on her nightstand, a holy card tucked into her wallet, a framed print of the Immaculate Heart in the kitchen. As a boy, I found it confusing. As a man, and especially as a pastor, I found it infuriating. It became the central conflict of my life, a spiritual battle waged right in my own family home. I would engage her in debates, armed with scripture, chapter and verse. I'd quote Exodus and Deuteronomy, pointing out the prohibitions against idols. She would just smile, a gentle, tired smile, and say, "Arthur, you see a statue. I see a reminder of a mother's love. God knows my heart." Her simple faith was impenetrable to my theological assaults, and that, more than anything, fueled my frustration. After she passed away, the duty of clearing out her home fell to Sarah and me. For Sarah, it was a sacred task, a way of honoring our mother's memory. For me, it became a mission, a crusade. I called it purifying the house. I went from room to room, gathering up the rosaries, the crucifixes, the holy water fonts. I told myself I was doing God's work, cleansing the home of spiritual corruption. Sarah followed behind me, quietly collecting the items I discarded, her face a mask of grief. The breaking point came when we reached the living room. On the mantelpiece, in the place of highest honor, was the plaster statue. It had been a wedding gift to my mother from her own mother. It had survived moves across 3 states, the raising of 2 children, and 70 years of quiet devotion. It was the last, most precious symbol of the faith I had spent my entire life fighting against. Sarah saw the look in my eye. "Don't, Arthur," she whispered. "Please. Not that one." It was Grandma's. But her plea only strengthened my resolve. This wasn't just a statue. It was a stronghold. A testament to a lifetime of what I considered misguided worship. And in my pride, in my absolute certainty, I decided it had to fall. I picked it up, feeling its weight in my hand, and walked toward the front door, my sister trailing behind me, her "No, no, no," a desperate fading prayer. That's when I turned, held it up for her to see, and delivered my verdict before executing the sentence. The silence that followed the crash was absolute. It was the sound of a chasm opening between my sister and me, a void filled only with the dust of broken plaster and the echoes of my own damning pride. I felt no remorse. Only a cold, clean sense of victory. I had defended the faith. I had honored God. I had no idea that I had just signed the warrant for the demolition of my own soul. That sound, the sound of that statue breaking, it echoed for weeks. It was the beginning of my own breaking. And if you've ever felt so sure of something, only to have your entire world turned upside down, maybe my story will mean something to you. If you're finding this story compelling, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you don't miss what happened next. And I'd truly love to know where you're watching from. Please leave a comment below and tell me what city or country you're in. It's a great comfort to know we're not alone in our journeys, no matter how different they may seem. For the next few weeks, the victory I felt turned to ash in my mouth. The silence from Sarah was louder than any argument we'd ever had. It was a dense, heavy thing that filled the spaces in my house, a constant, humming accusation. I tried to call her twice. The first time, it went to voicemail after one ring. The second time, a few days later, she picked up, and I heard her take a breath. But then, the line went dead. She had hung up on me. My own sister. I tried to pray, to find solace in the scriptures that had been my bedrock for my entire adult life. I'd open the Psalms, looking for words of comfort, but my eyes would glaze over. The words felt like stones, not bread. All I could hear was the gritty skid of that broken plaster on my mother's floor. All I could see was the look in Sarah's eyes. It wasn't anger. It was grief. As if she were mourning not just a statue, but the brother she once had. My fortress of faith, once so impenetrable, began to feel like a prison. The certainty that had been my shield now felt like a cage I had built for myself, bar by iron bar. I was Pastor Arthur, a man of God, but I was profoundly, terrifyingly alone. The drive was supposed to clear my head. A fellow pastor had invited me to a small conference 3 states over, up in the mountains. A retreat. A chance to be reminded of my purpose. I thought the long hours on the road, just me and the hum of the engine, would help me reset, to find that righteous fire again. But the further I drove, the more lost I felt. The sky, a brilliant blue when I left that morning, had curdled into a bruised, angry gray. By the time I started the ascent into the winding mountain passes, the heavens opened up. It wasn't just rain, it was a deluge. A sheet of water so thick the wipers on their highest setting could barely keep up, smearing the world into a blur of green and gray. The road became a black ribbon of glass, twisting and turning back on itself, with nothing but a flimsy guardrail separating me from the sheer drop into the valley below. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, and in that car, hurtling through the storm, the echoes in my head grew louder. Asterisk. This is an idol, an abomination. My own voice, booming with a confidence I no longer felt. And then, Sarah's whisper, "Please, Arthur, not that one." It was Grandma's. I tried to push it away. I turned on the radio, but between the crackle of static, a hymn came through. A slow, mournful rendition of Ave Maria. I snapped it off, my heart pounding with a strange mix of anger and fear. Blasphemy. Even here, it was following me. I began to pray out loud, forcing the words out. Lord, you are my rock and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? But the words had no power. They were just noise against the roar of the storm and the pounding in my own chest. It was the first time in my life that prayer felt like shouting into a void. There was no comfort, no presence, no still, small voice. Just the rain, the road, and the crushing weight of my own spirit. I was a man who had preached about the nearness of God for 35 years, and in my moment of desperate need, the heavens were silent. Or worse, they felt empty. The loneliness was a physical thing, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach. And for the first time, a terrifying thought crept in. What if I'm wrong? It happened in the space between one thought and the next. As I rounded a sharp blind curve, the world dissolved into light. Two brilliant, blinding beams cutting through the downpour, growing larger at an impossible speed. A semi-truck. It was hydroplaning, the massive trailer swinging out, jackknifing directly into my lane. There was no time to think, no time to react, no time even to scream. There was only the horrifying, deafening shriek of metal on metal, a sound that seemed to rip the fabric of the world apart. My car crumpled like a paper cup. The world became a violent kaleidoscope of shattering glass, the explosive pop of the airbag, and the sickening sensation of being thrown against my seatbelt as the car spun and twisted. I remember the smell of gasoline and rain and something else, something coppery. Blood. My blood. Then, a final bone-jarring impact as the car slammed into the rock face of the mountain. And then, silence. A silence even deeper than the one from my sister. A ringing in my ears. The rhythmic, maddening tick-tick-tick of the hazard lights. I was pinned. My legs were trapped, and a fire of agony was spreading through my chest. I tried to take a breath, but it was a shallow, ragged thing that ended in a wet cough. Through the shattered spiderweb of the windshield, I could see the rain still falling, washing the world clean. This is it, I thought. This is the end. I, Pastor Arthur, who had spoken so eloquently about eternity, was about to step into it. And I was terrified. The pride, the anger, the self-righteousness. It was all stripped away in an instant, leaving behind only a raw, primal fear. I closed my eyes, waiting for the judgment I knew I deserved. It's in those moments, isn't it, when everything is stripped away, that we find out what we're truly made of. When the noise stops and all you're left with is the truth of your own heart. If this story is touching you in some way, please let me know by hitting that like button. It means more than you know, and be sure to click the notification bell because you won't want to miss what happened when I opened my eyes again. I lay there in the twisted metal cage that had been my car, listening to the universe wind down to the sound of a ticking relay and the patter of rain on bent steel. The pain was a living thing, a bonfire in my chest and a white-hot scream in my legs. Every ragged breath I drew was a battle, and I could taste my own life, coppery and warm on the back of my throat. I was dying. I knew it with the same certainty I had once known my scripture. And in that moment, all the verses about hellfire and judgment I had hurled from the pulpit for 3 decades came rushing back, not as weapons, but as my own sentence. I had been a Pharisee, a man who polished the outside of the cup, while the inside was full of pride and contempt. I had broken my mother's heart, and then I had broken the last, most precious symbol of her faith. I had shattered her Mary. Now, I was the one who was shattered. I closed my eyes, not in prayer, but in surrender to the verdict. God, I whispered, the word a bloody bubble on my lips, be merciful to me, a sinner. It was the truest prayer I had ever prayed. And then, the darkness behind my eyelids wasn't dark anymore. It began as a warmth, a gentle pressure that seemed to push back against the crushing weight of the dashboard on my legs. The agonizing fire in my chest didn't vanish, but it was held, contained. The frantic ticking of the hazard light faded, replaced by a silence that was not empty, but full. A silence that listened. A light began to grow, not the harsh interrogating beam of a rescuer's flashlight, but a soft, luminous glow, like dawn seen through a veil. It had no source, yet it was everywhere. It filled the cramped, violent space of my coffin, with a peace that had no business being there. And in the heart of that light, a face began to form. It was her. I knew it instantly, with a certainty that dwarfed all my previous brittle convictions. It was the face from my mother's statue, but not plaster and faded paint. This was alive. It was the face of a mother looking at her child, who has fallen and scraped his knee. The lines around her eyes were etched with a sorrow, so profound it seemed to hold all the grief of the world. Yet her expression was not one of sadness, but of an impossible tenderness. Her eyes, they were the color of the sky after a storm, and they looked at me. Not through me, not past me, but at me. At Arthur, the man who had mocked her, despised her, and smashed her image into 1,000 pieces. I braced for the accusation, for the righteous anger, for the condemnation I so richly deserved. But it never came. There was no rebuke in her gaze. There was no "I told you so." There was only a love so vast, so unconditional, so merciful, that it broke me in a way the crash never could. It was a love that saw the frightened boy hiding inside the arrogant pastor. It saw the pain that fueled my anger. It saw every sin, every act of pride, every wound I had ever inflicted, and it did not turn away. Instead, it washed over me. In her eyes, I saw my own reflection, but not the broken, bleeding man pinned in the wreckage. I saw the man I was created to be, whole and beloved. The pride I had mistaken for strength dissolved into a torrent of shame. A hot, cleansing shame that burned away the years of self-righteousness. Tears I didn't know I had left to cry streamed from my eyes, mingling with the blood and the rain on my face. I was weeping for my mother, for my sister, Sarah, for the statue I had destroyed. But most of all, I was weeping because I was being looked upon with a love I had done nothing to earn and everything to reject. The light grew brighter, the peace became absolute, and as her face filled my entire being, I felt myself letting go, falling into an ocean of mercy. And then, everything went black. The next thing I knew was noise, a horrific, grinding screech of metal being torn apart. It was the sound of a can opener on a giant scale. Then voices, urgent and professional. "We've got a pulse. It's weak, but he's alive." A different voice, closer. "Sir? Can you hear me? We're gonna get you out. Just hang on." My eyes fluttered open. A paramedic's face, etched with concern, was peering in through a space where my door used to be. The rain had softened to a drizzle. The world of pain and cold steel came rushing back. But something was different. The terror was gone. The crushing loneliness was gone. I was broken, but I was not alone. I had not been alone. As they strapped me to a backboard and carefully lifted me from the mangled tomb, I looked up at the night sky, at the clouds breaking apart to reveal a few distant, shimmering stars. I had gone into that darkness expecting judgment, but I had found grace. A grace with a human face. A mother's face. The rescue team saved my body that night, but what happened in that darkness saved my soul. If you're still with me, please hit that like button to let me know. And turn on the notifications, because what the doctors found when I got to the hospital, and who I found waiting for me, changed everything all over again. The first few weeks in the hospital were a blur of pain, medication, and the sterile, rhythmic beeping of machines that measured the fragile rhythm of my life. My body was a roadmap of trauma: 3 broken ribs, a fractured femur, a concussion, and more stitches than I could count. But as the physical agony began to recede, it was replaced by a different kind of torment, one that no morphine drip could touch. It was a silent, relentless war waged in the landscape of my own mind. My opponent was the memory of a face made of light. The logical part of me, the pastor, the man who had built his life on the bedrock of provable textual fact, went to work immediately. It was a hallucination, of course. A textbook near-death experience. My brain, starved of oxygen, had simply projected an image from my subconscious. A Freudian cocktail of guilt and trauma. The face I saw was just a phantom, constructed from the memory of my mother's statue, an echo of the guilt I felt for destroying it. It was a coincidence that I saw her Stroke's face. It was the brain's last, desperate attempt to create meaning out of chaos before the lights went out. I would repeat these explanations to myself in the dead of night, like a catechism of disbelief. Trauma-induced hallucination. I'd whisper into the starched hospital pillow. Hypoxia. Coincidence. They were good, solid, scientific words. But they were weightless. They were stones skipping across the surface of an ocean, while the truth of the experience lay in the unfathomable deep. Because what science couldn't explain was the feeling. It couldn't explain the peace that had settled over me, a peace that defied the violent reality of my situation. It couldn't explain the mercy I felt in her gaze, a mercy that was more real than the shattered glass on the highway. My logical arguments were a flimsy shield against the memory of that unconditional love. And then, the small signs began. They were quiet, almost unnoticeable, but they chipped away at my fortress of denial. There was a volunteer at the hospital, an older woman, a Catholic sister. She never spoke about God. She would just come in, fluff my pillow, and make sure my water pitcher was full. One afternoon, as she was leaving, the light from the window caught the small silver medal she wore around her neck. I saw the image stamped on it, a woman with her arms outstretched, rays of light emanating from her hands. My heart seized in my chest. It was her. A few nights later, I had a dream. I was back in my mother's house, standing over the 1,000 broken fragments of the statue. But this time, when I knelt to touch them, the pieces weren't cold plaster. They were warm, and they glowed with a soft internal light. I woke up with my face wet with tears. This internal battle, this fight between my head and my heart, was the most exhausting I'd ever known. If you've ever felt that kind of struggle, please let me know by hitting that like button. And be sure to turn on notifications, because the next step I took was one I never imagined I'd have the courage to make. The more these quiet moments occurred, the more the shame grew. It was a physical sensation, a hot flush that started in my chest and spread to my face. I would lie in that hospital bed and be ambushed by memories of my own arrogance. I remembered a sermon I preached on the dangers of Marian devotion, my voice dripping with scorn as I mocked the rosary as a pagan chant of vain repetition. I saw the polite, pained faces in the congregation, some of whom I knew had Catholic family. I remembered a Christmas dinner years ago, arguing with my mother, telling her that her nativity scene was a graven image, and watching the joy drain from her face. I had weaponized my faith. I had used the Word of God not as a balm but as a hammer, and I had brought it down on the gentlest of hearts. The man in that pulpit, the man who smashed that statue, I didn't recognize him anymore. Or worse, I recognized him all too well, and I was disgusted. The pride I had mistaken for holiness was just a mask for fear. Fear of a faith that was more about mystery than rules, more about love than law. After 6 weeks, I was discharged. My leg was in a heavy cast, and I walked with crutches, each step a painful reminder of my fragility. Sarah, my sister, had come to the hospital once. She stood at the door, her face pale. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just looked at me, with those same pitying eyes she'd had when I broke the statue. She said, "I'm praying for you, Arthur," and left. Her prayer felt more like a judgment than her silence had. I couldn't go back to my house, not yet. I went to a small rehabilitation facility to regain my strength. And it was there, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, that I knew I couldn't run anymore. I had to face the source of my terror and my hope. I called a taxi, a thing I hadn't done in 30 years, and gave the driver an address that felt like treason on my tongue. St. Michael's Catholic Church, on Oak Street. The driver dropped me at the curb. I stood there for a long time, leaning on my crutches, just staring at the heavy oak doors. My heart was pounding. Every fiber of my being, every neuron conditioned by 35 years of preaching, screamed at me to turn back. This is the house of idols. This is the den of compromise. My own voice echoed in my head, a phantom of the pastor I used to be. But the man on the crutches, the man who had been held by a vision of light in a metal coffin, took a deep, shuddering breath and began the slow, painful journey up the stone steps. The doors were unlocked. I pushed one open, and the sound creaked through a silence so profound it felt ancient. I stepped inside, and the world changed. The air was cool and smelled of old wood, incense, and beeswax. Sunlight, fractured into 100 jewels of red and blue and gold, streamed through massive stained glass windows, painting the stone floor in patterns of light. My church had been a place of words, of sermons and hymns. This was a place of presence. My eyes darted around, taking in the stations of the cross, the flickering sea of votive candles, the silent, carved figures of saints. The old me was recoiling, cataloging every graven image, but the new me, the broken me, was just seeing. And then I saw her. In a small alcove to the side of the main altar, there was a statue of Mary. She was standing on a crescent moon, her hands clasped in prayer, her head bowed. I hobbled over, my crutches thudding softly on the marble, and slid into the front pew before her. I didn't kneel. I couldn't. I just sat there, my body aching, my soul in turmoil. I looked at her face, carved from wood and painted with a serene, gentle expression. It was just a statue, wood and paint. My mind knew that. But as I sat there, in that holy silence, the memory of the light, the memory of the face in my car, washed over me. The war inside my head finally fell silent. There were no more arguments, no more rationalizations. There was only a broken man sitting in front of a symbol of a mother's love. A tear slid down my cheek, hot and salty. I didn't have the words to pray. I didn't know how, so I just whispered into the sacred quiet, the truest, most humble words I had ever spoken. "I don't understand," I said. "Please, help me." That quiet plea in the silence of St. Michael's wasn't answered with a voice from heaven or a clap of thunder. It was answered with something far more mundane and far more profound, a hand on my shoulder. I looked up, startled, into the kind, wrinkled face of an old priest. He had a gentle smile. "The church is always open, my son," he said, "but you look like you're carrying a heavy load. Can I get you a cup of coffee?" And just like that, the first stone of a new path was laid. I didn't become a Catholic overnight. The truth is, I still haven't. My journey isn't about trading one set of doctrines for another. It's about learning a new language, the language of the heart. But news, as they say, travels fast. Especially news about a former fire and brimstone pastor seen hobbling out of a Catholic church. The phone started ringing. First it was Pastor Daniels, my old mentor. His voice was thick with concern. "Arthur," I heard. "Son, you've been through a terrible trauma. The mind plays tricks on you in those moments. The enemy is cunning. He'll use our guilt against us, dress himself up as an angel of light." He meant well. He was trying to rescue me from the very thing that had saved me. I listened patiently, something the old Arthur never would have done. When he was finished, I didn't argue. I didn't quote scripture back at him. I just said quietly, "Thank you for your concern, John. But what I saw, it was the most real thing that has ever happened to me." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I had offered him no ground for a fight, and he didn't know what to do with the peace in my voice. Others were not so kind. Old congregants would see me in the grocery store and turn down another aisle. A deacon from my former church stopped me in the parking lot, his face a mask of grim duty. "We're praying for you, Pastor," he said, but his tone made it sound like an exorcism. "We're praying that God delivers you from this deception." I was a project, a cautionary tale, the man who survived a wreck only to lose his soul to a Roman fantasy. To them, my experience wasn't a miracle, it was a seduction. It was a test I had failed. But their words, their rejection, it didn't pierce me the way it once would have, because I was no longer defending a fortress. I was learning to live in an open field. And slowly, I found others there with me, the people of St. Michael's. They didn't ask me about my theology, they asked me how my leg was healing. They brought me casseroles. They invited me to their Knights of Columbus pancake breakfast. They saw a man in pain, and they offered community, not a catechism. The rosary my mother had cherished, one that Sarah had salvaged from my purification, she sent it to me in a small box without a note. I held the smooth, cool beads in my hand. For the first time, I didn't see an idol. I saw a lifeline. I saw a story, bead by bead, of a son and his mother. I started to pray with it, awkwardly at first, my clumsy fingers fumbling over the beads, my voice whispering the words I had once condemned. And in the rhythm of the prayer, in the repetition I had once called vain, I found a quiet center, a place where the noise of the world and the noise of my own pride could finally fall silent. About 6 months after the accident, the parish held its annual fall festival. It was a simple affair, hot dogs, games for the kids, a bake sale. I was sitting at a picnic table, just watching the life of this community I had once despised. Children with sticky faces running through the grass, old couples holding hands, the priest laughing as he tried his hand at a ring toss. And I felt a nudge in my soul, a clear, undeniable calling. I knew what I had to do. With the help of my cane, I made my way to the small, makeshift stage where the parish council president was making announcements. I asked him if I could say a few words. He looked surprised, but he nodded and handed me the microphone. A hush fell over the crowd as I stood there, 100 faces turning to look at the stranger in their midst. My hands were shaking. "Good afternoon," I began, my voice unsteady. "My name is Arthur, and some of you may have known me as Pastor Arthur." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. For 35 years, I stood in a pulpit, and I preached what I thought was the truth. And part of that truth involved speaking out against the Catholic Church, against your faith, against your symbols, against your devotion to Mary. I had to pause to take a breath. I was wrong, I was arrogant, and I was blind, and I was cruel. I wrapped my own pride in the pages of the Bible and called it holiness. And my pride led me to hurt people I loved. It led me to break things that were sacred. It led me to a place of such profound emptiness that I almost died in it. I looked out at their faces. No one was judging. They were just listening. On a mountain road, in a storm, my life fell apart. And in the wreckage, when I was broken and bleeding and waiting for a judgment I deserved, I was met by a love I had done nothing to earn. A mother's love. The very love I had mocked. The very mother whose image I had shattered. She came to me. She didn't condemn me. She held me. What I rejected in my pride was the very thing that saved me in my brokenness. Tears were streaming down my face now, but I didn't care. I can't explain it. I can't defend it. I can only testify to it. I'm not here to talk about changing religions. I'm here to talk about a changed heart. I learned that faith isn't a fortress to be defended. It's a mystery to be entered. It's a hand to be held in the dark. I just want to say, I'm sorry for my intolerance, for my pride. And I want to say thank you for showing a broken man what mercy looks like. I handed the microphone back, and leaning heavily on my cane, I made my way back to my seat, to the sound of, not judgment, not confusion, but a warm, gentle, and welcoming applause. If my journey from a broken man to a man being made whole has resonated with you, if it has touched some part of your own story, would you do me the honor of clicking that like button? It's a small gesture that lets me know this testimony is reaching hearts. Every one of us has a story of a moment that changed everything, a moment where grace broke through. I would be so humbled if you would share a piece of your story in the comments below. What was the moment that mercy found you? And please, subscribe to the channel and click that notification bell. There is so much more to this journey of faith, and I would be blessed to continue sharing it with you.